1984. The Barents Sea was a frozen chessboard, patrolled by icebreakers and shadowed by sonar pings, where every ripple could signal a threat. The Soviet Northern Fleet, docked and armed for rapid response, had one job: detect and destroy any NATO naval incursion before it could threaten Soviet waters. With radar stations strung along the Kola Peninsula and early warning aircraft in rotation, they were confident no carrier group could approach without being seen. And yet, nothing appeared on the screens. At 0400 hours, the silence broke not with sound, but with impact. Explosions echoed across the frozen expanse of a simulated naval base in Murmansk. Precision hits tore through radar domes, command posts, and missile batteries. Officers scrambled. Radios lit up. Air defense systems frantically scanned the skies. But there were no incoming missiles, no distant aircraft formations, nothing on radar. As Soviet crews peered into the empty electronic void, NATO strike aircraft completed their run and turned back to sea unseen, untouched, and unopposed. This was not a hypothetical. During NATO's massive ocean safari and northern wedding exercises of the early 1980s, American aircraft carriers like the USS Eisenhower and USS Nimitz had launched full strike packages from over 500 miles away, far beyond Soviet detection range. The aircraft hugged the sea at low altitude, supported by airborne tankers and radar jamming squadrons. When they reached simulated Soviet targets, it was as if they had materialized from thin air. For Soviet commanders, this was more than a tactical surprise. It was a doctrinal earthquake. For decades, Soviet naval strategy had relied on the radar horizon as its first and most reliable layer of defense. But now, a fundamental truth emerged: the Americans didn't need to break through defenses. They could simply operate where those defenses could never see. One Soviet admiral, reportedly stunned by the post-exercise debrief, said only, "We've built walls, but they fly above the sky." The strike wasn't real, but the capability was, and the implications would soon haunt Soviet strategy from the Arctic to the Pacific. For decades, the Soviet Navy had planned for a future war that looked a lot like the last one, except faster and more violent. Battleships were gone, but the fundamentals remained: visibility, massed firepower, and radar-guided missiles. The key assumption that no carrier, no aircraft could threaten the Soviet Union without first being seen. And that was the fatal error. Inside the Operations Directorate of the Soviet General Staff, naval analysts developed layers of radar coverage extending from shore batteries to over-the-horizon platforms like the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear D. These aircraft patrolled the edges of the North Atlantic, searching for any sign of an approaching carrier strike group. Closer to home, high-frequency direction-finding stations dotted the Arctic Circle, triangulating signals with mathematical precision. But all of this relied on a single belief: that America would be forced to operate within the radar envelope to deliver a strike. It was not arrogance, it was doctrine. By 1982, Soviet naval thinkers had formalized this into the Bastion strategy. In this model, the Barents Sea and parts of the North Pacific became heavily defended sanctuaries, ringed with submarines, anti-ship missiles, and surveillance assets. They assumed that American carriers, to launch meaningful strikes, would have to cross into these zones. When that happened, Soviet forces would swarm and destroy them. They underestimated one crucial evolution: the range and coordination of American naval air power. Carrier-based aircraft like the A-6 Intruder and F/A-18 Hornet were now equipped with terrain-following radar, enabling them to fly below detection altitude. Supported by E-2 Hawkeye AWACS aircraft and Ka-6D tankers, these jets could launch from over 500 miles away, drop their payloads, and return without ever pinging a Soviet radar screen. Even worse, the U.S. Navy began experimenting with standoff weapons and decoys, like ADM-141 TAL drones, to draw Soviet radar attention away from the actual strike packages. These tools turned Soviet surveillance into a guessing game. Back in Moscow, generals reviewed the exercise footage. What they saw wasn't just a gap in radar coverage, it was a blindfold. The Americans weren't flying through the defenses. They were dancing around them. The radar screen had become a lie. And in the control rooms of the Red Banner Northern Fleet, confidence gave way to confusion. The Soviet Navy had long embraced a simple, brutal logic: geography is destiny, and sea control belongs to whoever can deny the most space. Soviet war planners called it layered defense. It was elegant on paper, devastating in simulation, and totally unprepared for the American playbook that was about to render it obsolete. Central to this doctrine was the Bastion concept, a shielded zone where Soviet ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, could patrol safely, ringed by surface vessels, attack submarines, long-range bombers, and shore-based missile systems. If the Americans came near, the layered defenses would trigger in sequence: detect, track, destroy. But the doctrine depended on time. Time to detect an approaching force, time to analyze radar signals, time to vector interceptors or submarines into the path of the intruders. Every ring of the Bastion, from sonar nets to radar pickets, bought precious seconds. Then came the U.S. Navy's deep strike revolution. By the early 1980s, American carrier strike groups had begun operating with a new level of cohesion. The old model, launching massed aircraft waves from within radar range, had been replaced with precision raids using long-range, low-observable platforms. The Navy's A-6 intruders, supported by EA-6B Prowler jamming aircraft, could fly nap-of-the-earth profiles through radar gaps and deliver laser-guided bombs with pinpoint accuracy. More importantly, the Navy didn't need to push its carriers into dangerous waters to deliver a knockout punch. This shattered Soviet assumptions. Their radar net was never meant to monitor the high seas far from the Kola Peninsula or the Sea of Okhotsk. Their picket ships couldn't match the agility of U.S. carrier air wings, and their interceptors, built for high-speed launches from coastal airfields, were too slow to catch aircraft that were already disappearing into the sea haze by the time a scramble order went out. When NATO exercises like Northern Wedding and Ocean Safari simulated long-range carrier strikes that struck Soviet targets from well beyond radar detection, Soviet officers initially dismissed it as theatrical. But when the after-action analysis arrived: timelines, altitudes, speed profiles, it became clear that this wasn't theory. It was a doctrine killer. If the U.S. could consistently strike Soviet targets before radar even registered a threat, then the entire concept of layered maritime defense was a strategic illusion. What good were overlapping missile envelopes if the enemy never had to enter them for the first time? The Soviet Navy realized they weren't building a shield. They were building a fence around empty air. It happened during Exercise Team Spirit 1986, a joint U.S.-South Korean military drill. What was supposed to be a routine show of alliance force turned into a data nightmare for Soviet naval intelligence. From deep within the Sea of Japan, over 600 miles from the nearest Soviet radar post, the U.S. Navy's USS Enterprise Strike Group launched an air assault timed to hit 6 simulated Soviet air defense nodes simultaneously. The attackers, a mix of A-6 intruders, FA-18 Hornets, and EA-6B Prowlers, coordinated by E-2C Hawkeye AWACS platforms, flying racetrack patterns hundreds of miles behind. The target profiles were chosen deliberately: radar stations on mountainous islands, mock command posts tucked into ravines, and hardened bunkers representing Soviet signals hubs. Every site was equipped with simulated radar emitters and acoustic sensors designed to mimic real Soviet surveillance protocols. At exactly 03:41 a.m. local time, the radars failed. Not one detection, not one scrambled response. The first Soviet-aligned observers learned of the attack from a satellite reconnaissance pass several hours later. The radar masts were still standing, but the mock stations had been obliterated. No trace of the attacking force had been captured. No emissions recorded. Not a single jet tracked in or out. For Soviet naval doctrine, this was not just a failure. It was a fantasy turned to ash. The range of the strike, over 600 miles from the carrier deck, should have been impossible without satellite support or ground-based relay. But the Americans had pulled it off using a layered command network that operated independently of terrestrial infrastructure. Aircraft communicated directly with each other using encrypted data links. Jammers masked their approach. AWACS aircraft guided their final vectors, and refueling tankers allowed them to return safely without ever breaking altitude. Worse still, American intelligence had known exactly where to strike. Soviet analysts scrambled to understand how the U.S. had acquired the coordinates of these simulated radar installations' locations that mimicked real Soviet hardware configurations. Some speculated a mole within Warsaw Pact forces. Others feared a breakthrough in satellite-based SIGINT. What none of them wanted to admit this was what happened when a military clung to doctrine, while the enemy rewrote the rules. In a declassified memo circulated weeks later among Soviet Fleet Command, one line stood out in red ink. If this is representative of U.S. first strike capability, our radar strategy is not outdated, it is irrelevant. That single sentence sparked an emergency review across every theater of Soviet naval operations. It was no longer a question of whether they could track the Americans. It was whether they'd ever see them coming again. The Soviet General Staff convened a special closed-door session inside the Defense Ministry's Ryazan complex, an underground facility built for strategic war planning. Present were top commanders from the Red Banner Northern Fleet, Pacific Fleet, the 8th Directorate of Electronic Warfare, and senior representatives from the KGB. On the table, the unthinkable report from the Sea of Japan. Admiral Vladimir Chernovin, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, opened the session with a cold stare and a colder truth. Our network was blind, our response time was 0, and our enemies didn't even need to be seen. The room fell silent. Soviet admirals insisted it had to be a simulation failure. No strike group could deliver coordinated munitions from over 500 miles out, through jamming zones, without a single radar contact. They blamed bad data, flawed emitters. American manipulation. The KGB took a darker tone. A high-ranking officer from the 1st Chief Directorate suggested that the Americans may have deployed a next-generation satellite system capable of real-time, high-resolution targeting from low orbit. If true, it meant Soviet coastal defenses were permanently compromised. But another theory was even more unnerving. What if the Americans didn't need satellites at all? This was the moment Soviet command began to confront an unsettling realization. This was not just an issue of range or radar gaps. This was about system architecture. The Americans had created an integrated battlefield, where every unit aircraft, ship, AWACS, jammer functioned like a synchronized machine. Soviet systems, by contrast, were designed in vertical silos, isolated units, each with its own limited sphere of awareness. Chernovin called for immediate verification. 2 Tupolev Tu-95 reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to tail the next U.S. carrier group during its return transit. They flew multiple orbits. Not one active radar signature could be traced back to strike aircraft. The carrier stayed over the horizon. Yet photo analysis revealed deck movements, aircraft launches, and recoveries all conducted with chilling precision. On paper, the carrier never existed. It was the final straw. Moscow still refused to admit the full scale of the failure publicly. But internally, panic gave way to silence. Funding for new coastal radars was frozen. Instead, a special unit under the GRU was tasked with uncovering exactly how American systems talk to each other across such vast distances. Western military technology journals, once dismissed as capitalist exaggeration, were now being translated by hand. But no matter how many theories Moscow proposed, one fact remained immutable. The Americans were now dictating the terms of visibility itself. The Soviet response came quickly but fatally misdirected. By mid-1986, Soviet electronics firms under the Ministry of Radio Industry were given a new priority directive design high-power radar arrays capable of penetrating jamming fields and locating low RCS radar cross-section targets at extreme distances. The assumption was simple if U.S. aircraft were vanishing. It had to be because of stealth shaping or electronic jamming. The solution, Soviet planners believed, was brute force radar. Enter the Nebo-M early prototypes, massive, multiband radar complexes designed to operate across VHF, UHF, and L-band frequencies. In theory, such a system could detect even stealthy aircraft by observing how different frequencies scattered off composite surfaces. To Soviet engineers, this was the future of visibility. But they were solving the wrong problem. What had happened off the coast of Japan wasn't about detection. It was about integration. The U.S. didn't just build better stealth aircraft. It built a warfighting network where every node, AWACS, fighters, bombers, jammers, satellites fed into a central architecture. Even when one element went dark, the others filled the gap. American strike groups could operate in near-total EM silence, relay targeting data via secure data link, and launch precision strikes without ever breaking formation. Meanwhile, Soviet systems remained rigid. Their fighters relied on ground-based radar for vectoring. Their bombers used pre-planned strike profiles. Their radar stations operated independently, with minimal cross-theater data sharing. In short, their entire air grid was built for a different century. Yet instead of rethinking this architecture, Moscow doubled down on size and strength. The first Nebo-M prototypes were deployed to the Far East, but couldn't coordinate with S-200 missile systems fast enough to track fast, low-altitude targets. Worse, they created massive emission signatures, giant beacons for any U.S. electronic warfare team looking for something to blind. In classified assessments, U.S. Navy analysts quietly marveled at the Soviet approach. They are building eyes, one report concluded, but they still have no brain. The irony was brutal. In trying to see the invisible, Soviet engineers missed what was right in front of them, a total collapse of doctrine. And back in the field, American carrier groups continued to operate with impunity. By the time the Soviets realized they were chasing shadows, it was too late. They were trying to jam ghosts. When the radar upgrades failed to bring results, Soviet planners pivoted. This time, the focus shifted from hardware to human intervention. At a closed session of the General Staff's Air Defense Directorate in Kaliningrad, a new working theory was circulated. The Americans weren't using stealth or jamming to hide. They were exploiting gaps in Soviet command latency. The logic was deceptively elegant. Soviet detection systems were built around tiered authorization protocols. Missile batteries required clearance from radar command centers, which in turn relayed information up to district commands before any response could be triggered. These steps, designed to prevent accidental escalation, created crucial windows of inaction. The Americans, the new theory proposed, were simply moving faster inside these windows, using AWACS aircraft to guide strikes from beyond radar range. They could hit targets and vanish before Soviet command loops had completed their decision cycle. Thus, the new solution wasn't more radar. It was decentralization. Orders were sent to test real-time fire control authority at the regimental level. Select S-300 operators in the Baltic and Far East regions were granted conditional launch permissions without central clearance. Field commanders were urged to conduct snap response drills, hypothetical attacks in which U.S. aircraft would appear, strike, and retreat within 90 seconds. But reality refused to cooperate. In every simulation, the result was the same, even with instant authorization. By the time Soviet radars detected incoming threats and scrambled fighters or activated SAM systems, the American aircraft were gone. Not because of slow decision-making, but because the data itself never arrived in time. In short, the Americans weren't outmaneuvering Soviet protocols. They were operating on a battlefield the Soviets couldn't even see, and the second theory collapsed just as painfully as the first. Yet the failure cut deeper this time, because if decision speed wasn't the problem, then the Soviet command structure, painstakingly constructed over decades, wasn't just inefficient, it was obsolete. No new rule of engagement could compensate for sensors that didn't detect. No promotion in fire control authority could fix a radar picture that never updated in real time. And so, for the second time in a year, Soviet command was forced to confront a disturbing conclusion: their adversary had created a new kind of war. Not just faster, but parallel. A war of machines that spoke to one another across air, sea, and space, while Soviet systems still relied on shouted orders and analog scopes. As one classified memo from the KGB's Military Technical Directorate noted with chilling precision, "We are not one war behind. We are one paradigm behind." The rot started at the top. In the fall of 1987, the KGB's 8th Main Directorate, the branch responsible for signals intelligence, delivered a deeply flawed assessment to the Defense Ministry, based on intercepted NATO communications and airborne telemetry. The report claimed U.S. carrier groups were operating under unusually tight sortie limits. It concluded that American naval aviation was stretched thin, over-reliant on a handful of forward-deployed platforms, and vulnerable to saturation attack. The assessment was not only wrong, it was suicidal, because while Soviet analysts were counting launch cycles and fuel loads, they missed the one thing the Americans had perfected: integrated battle-space deception. Each time a U.S. carrier battle group deployed, it was surrounded not by a single perimeter, but by layers of false signals, decoy aircraft, and spoofed radar echoes. Electronic warfare squadrons launched ghost aircraft into radar corridors, drawing Soviet attention to phantom strikes. Meanwhile, the real payloads came from the flanks, guided in by satellites, drones, and invisible AWACS radar domes orbiting well beyond the Soviet horizon. But none of this reached Soviet Central Command. The intelligence network was compromised not by spies, but by assumptions. KGB field operatives tasked with monitoring American movements used outdated listening posts and antenna arrays that couldn't distinguish between real and synthetic signals. Worse, internal communication within the KGB's technical directorates was compartmentalized to the point of paralysis. Engineers working on radar upgrades had no access to intercepted American data link protocols. Cybersecurity teams didn't even know that satellite uplinks were being jammed. And when reports did make it through, they were filtered for political survivability. No senior officer wanted to explain why a $3 billion coastal radar grid had been blind to an entire carrier group. The result was silence. By the time U.S. Navy FA-18 Hornets struck mock targets in the Barents Sea without Soviet radar even registering a presence, it was too late. The mock strike had not been a war game. It was a demonstration, and Soviet intelligence had failed to even grasp the message. In a post-mortem conducted years later, one disillusioned GRU analyst confessed the truth in a private debrief. They weren't hiding from us. They just didn't care if we saw, because they knew we couldn't act fast enough to stop them. Not a failure of sensors, not a failure of courage, a failure of imagination. It wasn't just stealth or radar jamming, or even electronic warfare. The true American system, the one that terrified Soviet commanders, was built around something far more difficult to detect and infinitely harder to defeat: seamless integration. In war rooms from Norfolk to Ramstein, the Americans had spent the 1980s building a machine that was no longer just made of aircraft, ships, and satellites. It was made of connections. Each unit, whether an F-14 Tomcat, an E-3 AWACS, or a Los Angeles-class submarine, was no longer a lone node. It was a sensor, a relay, and a weapon, all feeding into a unified living network. The backbone of this system was not metal, but code. Data fusion algorithms, tactical data links, and real-time satellite uplinks turned every platform into part of a distributed brain. If one radar saw an enemy fighter, they all saw it. If a submarine picked up engine noise, it fed that location directly to strike aircraft orbiting 200 miles away. And then came the AWACS. To the Soviet mind, these airborne radar systems, giant, slow-moving aircraft with spinning dishes, were targets. But to the Americans, they were orchestras. From 35,000 feet, the E-3 Sentry didn't just see aircraft. It commanded the sky. It coordinated fighter intercepts, assigned jamming tasks, sorted threat priorities, and handed off targets between squadrons in seconds. The Soviets still thought in terms of platforms. Americans were now thinking in systems. This is what allowed U.S. fighters to fire missiles from beyond visual range, guided by radar they didn't even carry. This is what allowed carrier strike groups to launch coordinated air campaigns while still hidden behind the curvature of the Earth. This is how the Americans replaced brute force with omniscient precision. Soviet pilots found themselves in the middle of air battles they didn't know had started. Tank commanders received orders to deploy to areas that had already been hit, and radar crews stared at blank screens. Not because their equipment was malfunctioning, but because the war had already passed them by. One declassified Pentagon memo from 1990 described the architecture bluntly sensor-to-shooter in under 60 seconds. That was the new kill chain. From the moment an enemy radar lit up or a heat signature was spotted, the system did the rest. It assigned assets, calculated engagement parameters, launched weapons, and recorded results all before the human operators had finished their initial radio call. To the Soviets, this bordered on sorcery. Their doctrine had emphasized mass, redundancy, and mechanical resilience. The American system replaced all three with information, and information moved faster than steel. As the Cold War approached its final decade, this shift was no longer theoretical. In every joint exercise, every NATO alert drill, and every secret intercept, Soviet forces saw the same pattern they were fighting yesterday's war, and the Americans were already preparing for tomorrow's. It was called Red Sky, but the Soviets would remember it by another name the night their doctrine died. In 1988, under cover of a routine NATO exercise, the United States launched the most complex electronic warfare simulation in naval history. It began 250 miles off the Norwegian coast. A U.S. carrier strike group, led by the USS Theodore Roosevelt, simulated an approach into the Barents Sea, one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the Soviet arsenal. The objective was simple: penetrate, strike, and vanish without triggering a single Soviet air defense alarm. And it worked. From the moment American aircraft launched, nothing followed the Soviet script. Soviet coastal radar operators, hardened veterans of multiple intercept drills, detected only scattered anomalies, blips, ghosts, random noise. The AWACS, orbiting beyond the detection arc, directed a squadron of FA-18s fitted with ALQ-99 jamming pods to create holes in the radar network. Simultaneously, EA-6B prowlers spoofed Soviet communications, mimicking internal command and control chatter while feeding false coordinates. Then, in total silence, U.S. Navy Tomahawk cruise missiles struck 6 designated targets, dummy structures meant to simulate SAM sites and early warning posts. Not one simulated missile was intercepted. Soviet response time had collapsed from an expected 4 minutes to nearly 12. The airspace had been effectively blind. Worse, the system failed to verify whether the strike had even occurred. Soviet generals were left wondering whether it had been a test or a real attack they had simply missed. Humiliation came not from defeat in battle, but from not being invited to it. In the war rooms of Moscow, panic turned to introspection. The Ministry of Defense demanded a full audit of its early warning systems. Red Navy admirals called for emergency funds to modernize their radar arrays. KGB analysts scrambled to explain how a full carrier group could operate within theoretical engagement range without detection. One GRU memo, later obtained through declassification, admitted the unthinkable. If hostilities had been declared, the Northern Fleet would not have survived the first hour, and the Americans weren't done. Just weeks later, a second exercise, this time dubbed Phantom Dagger, was conducted in the eastern Mediterranean. U.S. forces simulated the disabling of an entire Soviet coastal missile division using a combination of airborne electronic attack and standoff munitions. Again, Soviet observers saw nothing until after the targets had been destroyed. The message was clear. The Americans had built a system that didn't need to survive Soviet defenses. It would simply bypass them. Not brute force, not attrition, precision, speed and silence. One Soviet radar colonel, witnessing a debrief on the exercise, reportedly muttered, "They don't even need to fight us anymore." The humiliation wasn't tactical. It was existential. By proving that an entire branch of the Soviet military could be rendered irrelevant, not with bombs, but with code, the U.S. had achieved something far more destabilizing than victory. They had rewritten the terms of war, and the Soviet Union, for all its tanks, missiles, and doctrine, had no counter. The Soviet Union was built on scale, on mass, redundancy, and the overwhelming weight of numbers. Its air defense strategy mirrored its ideology, layer upon layer of radar coverage, anti-aircraft artillery, and surface-to-air missile sites. To challenge the sky was to invite annihilation. That was the theory. But theories shattered when reality came cloaked in silence. After the back-to-back humiliations of Red Sky and Phantom Dagger, a quiet war broke out not between nations, but within the Soviet military establishment. The Air Defense Forces PVO clashed with the Red Navy, who blamed coastal radar blind spots. The VVS, the Soviet Air Force, insisted on urgent modernization of interception protocols. And deep inside the corridors of the Ministry of Defense, something far more dangerous took root: doubt. The core belief that Soviet radar could detect and neutralize any threat before it reached vital targets was no longer just questioned, it was discarded. A classified internal review of the Northern Exposure drills, conducted by the Soviet Academy of Military Sciences in early 1989, offered a chilling conclusion. American strike systems now operate in a dimension not accounted for in our defense planning. Theoretical ranges are irrelevant if detection is delayed by even 60 seconds. Translated into strategic terms, that meant the Soviets could no longer guarantee the survival of their command infrastructure during a first strike. The invulnerability of their rear echelon, the ideological and operational bedrock of deterrence, had been compromised. This was not merely a tactical vulnerability. It was an existential threat. For decades, the Soviet war doctrine had assumed that NATO air power could be managed through attrition-layered SAMs, dispersal of assets, and dense flak corridors. But American innovations, stealth, electronic warfare, airborne command, and low-altitude strike tactics had leapfrogged attrition. The Americans were now playing a different game altogether, and the Soviets couldn't even see the pieces, ideologically. This was devastating. The USSR had defined itself against the West not just through political dogma, but through a conviction of military parity. From tanks to missiles to aircraft, every parade through Red Square was a performance of strength. But now, the most expensive branch of that performance, air defense, was revealed to be obsolete in the face of one innovation: invisibility. Marshal Viktor Kulikov, one of the most respected military minds in the Warsaw Pact, reportedly told Politburo members in a closed-door session, "If our enemies can strike without warning, without detection, and without loss, then all our arsenals are decorations." That wasn't defeat. That was irrelevance. The United States hadn't just pierced the Soviet shield, it had rendered the concept of a shield meaningless. What followed was an avalanche of internal reforms, rushed procurement requests, and desperate attempts to field radar systems that could counter stealth. But it was too late. By 1991, the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. But buried deep in that rubble was a simple truth, whispered too late to matter. They had prepared for war with mass. The Americans had answered with mastery. Today, American carrier strike groups roam oceans not as relics, but as floating proof of a Cold War doctrine that never needed firing a shot to win battles. High above or far below detection, their power remains built on the very foundation that shattered Soviet illusions: invisibility, precision, and timing. In the modern era, stealth isn't just a feature, it's a philosophy. From B-2 bombers to F-35s, from satellite-guided munitions to cyber infiltration, the lesson endures: dominance doesn't come from numbers. It comes from the ability to act without being seen. and strike before a defense can react. The Soviet military, reconstituted as part of Russia's armed forces, would never again build an air defense network with the same faith in radar supremacy. Even today, the ghosts of those NATO drills linger in Russian doctrine, which now invests heavily in integrated sensor fusion and passive detection. But despite all the innovation, the memory persists. Their empire's confidence began to erode not in the streets of Berlin, but in the cold radar rooms of the Arctic, where screens once showed silence. And then, too late, smoke. In war games and classified after-action reports, one phrase continues to echo, detected too late. It wasn't about firepower. It was about foresight, and the side that saw first won.